Welcome to another Living Grief conversation. I'm Katie Cowling, a counsellor here at St Elizabeth Hospice. This recorded conversation is to explore how we can support our friends and family through bereavement and understand what grief might feel like. I want to mention that we will be talking about death and dying today, and I appreciate this might be very sensitive and triggering. Today I'm joined with Annie Broadbent, who is an author of Speaking of Death and is a psychotherapist. This book is built on her expert knowledge and personal experience of loss. Thank you, Annie, for coming along today.
You're welcome.
It's so nice to have somebody who's got personal experience and a knowledge of loss in yourself as well, within how you work with people, but also with your own experiences. Now, we mentioned that obviously you've written your book, Speaking of Death, and I just thought to start off with, it might be really good to hear a bit about your book. Tell us a bit about what your book looks like and feels like as a reader.
Okay. So it is, I suppose, primarily a book for friends and supporters of the bereaved. That was kind of who I had in mind when I was writing the book. But as it's turned out, it's actually ended up being a great resource for people who are going through their own experience of loss as well. It's a collection of stories, really. So it was inspired by my own experience of loss 13 years ago. And I realised that there was quite a lot of support out there for me as the person who was bereaved. But the kind of friends and family around me who were doing their best to support me didn't have anywhere to turn to. So I was spending a lot of time guiding them in how to support me. That also says a lot about me, and why I ended up probably training as a therapist. But I did think that was sort of unfortunate that there wasn't there weren't resources, there wasn't a hub, there wasn't somewhere to go. And so I started putting things down on paper. And initially, obviously, it was about my own experience of what I was going through in terms of my grief, but also what I was experiencing in terms of how people were responding to me. And it didn't take long before I realised that wasn't enough to write a whole book. You know, I needed to get other people's experiences too, both to get a sense of what the themes were, where the similarities were, but also, you know, how different things could be. So that's what it's ended up being. It's a collection of stories. People have experienced sort of what I would call immediate loss. And it's a mix of their experience and also some quite specific tips. What's helpful, what's not helpful. Yeah.
And it's interesting because, as you were saying, that often when someone's been bereaved, or just any difficult part in their life, people will say, what can I do? If I can do something, let me know if there's anything to do. But in that moment, it's like, well, I don't know what I need. And actually what I need, you can't bring my loved one back. So it's interesting you're saying that you were having to kind of guide them actually what you needed, what you need from them. And I suppose I can hear people say things like, right, I'm just going to bring this lasagna around because this is what I can do right now. And actually people I've worked with have been like, that was so helpful, because the last thing I was thinking about was cooking for my family.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's like these people just need to be able to do. And your book's obviously providing that kind of sharing knowledge about how your people are experiencing it, and then what might they need in those moments of that. And you were obviously experiencing that in your own time as well. And also sort of that connection of not really knowing where to go to get help for your bereavement, didn't know about other people that are coming together with groups or any kind of hubs. But that's something that we're currently trying to do at the hospice here, provide that connection for people with our walk-on groups or our counselling service, but also our websites that people can go back to and look at that. So it's quite nice to hear that in your moment, obviously I would have loved that you'd felt more supported then, but actually what we're providing is kind of from your story, I can hear that actually we're hopefully moving in that right direction.
Yeah.
But yeah, and what inspired you to write the book? Because obviously when you're gone through your own loss, that can be quite difficult. So with my clients, I'm quite often asking them maybe to journal if they feel that would be something helpful for them. And I think, because I really believe that writing down can be so therapeutic. Creative writing can be really therapeutic. And I wonder if that might have been a part of your reason to write the book. But what did inspire you to write your book?
I think there's many different ways I could answer that question.
Okay.
And we wouldn't have long enough really to kind of go into it. It's sort of multifaceted. On one level, it was my mum who died 13 years ago, and it was her. She inspired me to write the book because she had been talking about wanting to write a book about how to what to say and what not to say to someone who's dying.
Okay.
So this was something we had been sort of talking about in her final few months.
Gosh, that must have been quite a difficult conversation to be having together, or did that feel?
It was very difficult. It was difficult, and I think in the way that many of your listeners might recognise, it also, because you can never really know that the person who's dying is actually going to die forever, it's sort of possible to get into that zone of having those conversations, or it can be. So often I've sort of looked back and gone, God, I can't believe I had those chats. But then I realised I didn't really know. I would have said I knew. I would have said, no, I recognise that my mum is dying. But that was all quite sort of cognitive, actually on a kind of whole person level. I hadn't understood, because I think in a way you can't really fully know until it's happened, until you go through day after day after day after day and they still haven't come back. And in that sense, that's one of the biggest themes I've found in working with people with grief is the longevity of it. It never fails to take people by surprise. So that's one aspect of it. So that was kind of, that was sort of in the collective conscious, when she died. And of course, after she died, I couldn't write that book for her. And then I suppose another answer to that is that it was my grief that inspired me. I was really driven by my pain. Right. It was a force. It's ended up being an amazing force for good. Part of that pain was I was pissed off. I was really pissed off. And we could get into all sorts of analysis about, how much it was actually about me being pissed off that my mum had died and all of that, but it's still very real that that people, with the best intentions floundered and were awkward or disappeared and ignored what had happened. And I felt sort of, I think at times I felt kind of flabbergasted in a way that this experience, this phenomenon that, is arguably the only certainty we have in life. We're all going to die.
Yeah, that's true.
And therefore, we're all going to come into contact with it at some point through someone else's death. That it's still so taboo. So that was a big inspiration. And most people that know me well will say, I like saying unsaid stuff, which is probably why my job suits me. But yeah, so that was a big motivation.
You wanted to get words out there that people were too scared to say, by the sounds of things. And when you said you were like angry and frustrated, are you talking about because of your loss, or are you talking about how people reacted to you when you lost? What was the main focus of those feelings?
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, there was all my own processing going on about my own loss. But in this context, I'm talking about the frustration with, with how people around me were responding, and that's not to say that is universal. I was young, to lose a parent. And of course, and I've worked with people who've lost parents much later in their life.
Right.
Family, I've seen family lose their parents later in life. And I've seen it's different, of course it's different. But there is still this pattern in our culture of recoiling from death and grief.
Yes.
So however well supported and well prepared someone might be, the fact still remains that we haven't quite figured out how to talk about these big inevitable things in life. And I think we should try and figure that out.
And I love that when you mentioned, like, the one thing that we've all got in common is that we are all going to have our end of life. Everyone, we're either going to be connected to others who have their end of life before us, but we're all going to have our day in that moment. Like, that is one thing that there's not a choice in life of, do I go to this way, do I go to university, or it's that is one thing that brings us all together. But actually we find bereavement is what pulls us often quite far apart. And lots of people are so scared by talking about death and dying and talking about these really difficult conversations that they end up saying nothing. And no one gets to actually talk about those moments, which when you said about your mum did have those conversations, I thought that must have been really quite empowering, because these conversations we don't always get the time to do it, obviously, because if somebody has passed away quicker than we expect, or the families don't want to have those conversations. But actually, when it comes to supporting someone who's bereaved, we've spoken in the past about things like Christmas cards, like actually mentioning the person that they've lost that year is really quite important, because it's bringing up that feeling of, do you know what, I really understand how difficult this time of year is going to be for you. Whereas often people won't write anything about what they might have been through that year, and that can be harder to receive than to have something that actually brings up some emotion for them. It's like we try to step away from these emotions, but actually perhaps we need to step into them and feel them more, and be okay with supporting that person within their feelings. But I know that's quite a scary thought for many, but I do think that bereavement tends to make people say, if I just don't mention it, then that's okay. Yeah. But that's not okay, not always. And I know some people prefer, if they go out and they're socialising with people, they don't want to talk about it at all. And that's also a different experience, and that's fine. But there are some people that do want to talk about it.
Yeah, and I think we can check.
Yes.
We can check that out. I think that would be one of my sort of biggest encouragements, or is ask your friend, what's helpful. You go to a party, like, I'm aware this has happened, do you want to talk about it? And you can just test it out. Don't assume. And because everyone is going to be different, and everyone's going to be different at different points in their process. So what works for one moment isn't going to necessarily work the next week.
Every time, absolutely.
So it's like be relational, bring yourself, be yourself. the sort of the paralysis and the stuckness and the fear of getting it wrong. That's all the they're all the ingredients for creating distance and division.
How many times we've all said, and we'll all said it, counsellors and people who, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to make you cry. But actually, maybe that's what they need to do. But like you said, check in with them. Is it okay to have this conversation? Do you want to step out and have the conversation? Do you want me to contact you in a couple of weeks and let's just have a chat about it? Or, we won't talk about it today if you don't want to. That check-in, I think, is a really valid point that I think quite a lot of the listeners might be able to take away from that. And you've covered kind of what I was going to ask next, actually, a little bit here. Because in your book, you write about your own experience, but you've also got other people's stories that you've shared too. And I just wondered how much similarities were coming up when you did that, or what was really different, and what you might have connected with that, because we know that grief experiences are different for everybody. But we also do know that when we get people together who have just been bereaved or have been all different times of bereaved, there's those kind of it's like you become to understand each other in such a different level. So did you find similarities? Did you find differences when you experienced other people's loss?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of inevitable, isn't it, that there would be differences because of how diverse our experience of loss can be, depending on who's died, how they've died, how old the person who's left behind is, what their own life conditions are. So all of those factors and many more massively influence someone's experience of grief, and also, cultural impact, sort of aspects in terms of the way death and dying is talked about. So things like, physical affection. Some people I spoke to really treasured hugs, from anyone and everyone at every time. And perhaps that's because they were okay with crying at any point. Who knows? Some people really didn't want hugs, either because they didn't want to be feeling vulnerable in that particular moment in a hug, or because it actually inhibited them. Sometimes if you're in the middle of crying, sort of having someone wrap themselves around you is an inhibitor. So, those kind of things varied. How much people wanted to talk about the person who's died. In terms of sort of similarities or themes that I felt like I saw throughout the people I interviewed, and also just in my work.
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah. Which I think I mentioned just before, but is that there's no end to grief.
Right.
And that can often come as a shock. So quite often I will get clients coming and they want to sort of finish their grieving. They come because they want to sort of do their grieving and then go away having done their grieving. For me, it's often a kind of, there's a bit of education that happens that, as far as I'm concerned, grief is a lifelong process because, and for me, thank goodness, because the relationship is lifelong. The person has died, but your relationship with that person lives for as long as you do. So, in that sense, our experience of grief and the way we process their death will evolve. It will grow as we do. Every time we have a new experience, they are factored in some way. And I think, many people I spoke to for the book, many people I've worked with, that's come up a lot, whether they knew that was going to happen or not, that somehow they realise at some point this thing they're going through is with them for good, really, on some level.
And that can be
other
quite
people
scary, can't it?
Can be really scary and quite lonely. when the people around you might be sort of thinking, are you better yet?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
yes.
you were grieving then, you know, and there's this kind of sense of a linear aspect to the process.
Yeah, because society kind of fits that. Like, if we take time off work, then we have the funeral, and then we have to step back into the normal world. And yeah, you do go back to normal daily activities, but that doesn't mean that your grief process has got that start and end part that you were saying. There isn't any ending. And I think working with people and experience of loss is that we will always want to miss the person, because that builds up, that keeps our relationship with them. But what happens at the very beginning is missing someone is just it's so powerful that you're completely, everything you do is about the grief. And then as time goes on, that there's that feeling that actually you're adapting because of the time that's gone on, not because just time's passed, not because this is your starting point, this is your ending point, but it's that process that you've taken to adapt to your life that you are now in. But you're still going to miss them. So then the pain doesn't feel like pain, it feels like missing, which, you know, I think is what sort of you were saying about how that end point doesn't ever come. And actually, sometimes when you say that to people, they're like, so I'm going to feel this forever. And it's like, yes, but perhaps not in the same way.
Yeah. There's that lovely, I'm sure you'll know it, you know, the growing around grief model.
Theory,
which I love, and I find it a really helpful sort of comfort to that particular question, you know, when people think, oh God, am I going to feel like this exact way? It won't, hopefully. But we as we change, as we grow, as we experience new life, meet new people, there's a bit of space that's created between us and this very precious nugget of grief, which represents our relationship with this person that we loved. And I like that because it sort of gives space for both. It allows room for the pain to coexist with life and with growing and with happiness, maybe, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, going back to your book, chapter 18, you've got a short chapter that's do's and don'ts to do in bereavement, and I think it's just a really fabulous guide on kind of how to be around people who's been bereaved, because it's like it gives you kind of a way of how to act with somebody. So I think anybody who has been supporting somebody who's bereaved, and I'm talking friends, family, professionals, all sorts of people, can sort of take something from that. What would you say is like the most important thing that we can offer someone when they've lost someone? From having written that little part, I thought you'd be the best person to ask.
I mean, in a way, we've already touched on it in the sense that, and I recognise this may sound sort of a bit vaguer than people might like, but I suppose be yourself is the best thing, and I think it's the best thing, and often it's the hardest thing, because we can get into this sort of stiff place of fear where we don't want to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. And if we can just loosen up and remember this is still our friend, and that they would much rather that we bring ourselves than kind of become rigid in an attempt to kind of get it right, because often people feel like they've got to sort of take care of their friend who's supporting them. You know, I can see they're so awkward. I've got to make sure that they don't worry about me. They're so uncomfortable. So if we can relax as their friends, if we can relax, and as I was saying before, ask them, what is helpful for you? Not what can I do? That is a big don't. Think of something to do and do it. And food is a great thing, always. Make a meal or buy some ready meals or whatever it is. And try as much as possible to just think of specific things to do for them. Don't rely on the person to tell you what's helpful, especially in the early days. They don't have the cognitive functioning to do that. But ask them, you know, do you want to talk about it right now? Like we were just saying.
Yeah.
Should we watch a movie? That you don't have to have all the answers. And the other thing actually I would say is, and it's sort of part of that, is acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Acknowledge the death. And you will get a sense from the person's reaction whether or not they want to then go into it.
Mm.
And maybe they don't, not everyone does, and that might be enough. But not acknowledging it is like denying something so fundamental to someone's experience. It can be excruciating.
I'm like, as you're talking, I'm thinking about people who might listen to this, who have been bereaved, and then sending it to people that they know, just to be like, can you listen to this? Because this will really help me. But there was something I think I read from your book, and I think is really important, as you were talking about that, about being yourself. Like, if you and your friend do have humour with each other and jokes, don't stop doing that.
Yeah. Bring
Bring the jokes in. And sometimes we do, in these moments, we do start to get a bit of dark humour coming out of us. But I think we need to, again, not be scared to be like, actually, we can have a laugh. This is still a moment where, that still needs to be lived through. I appreciate that for some people that isn't able to be reached yet. But I suppose what I'm saying is, like you said, be yourself.
Yeah.
So if that was what you and your friend or family member would have been like, don't be afraid to do that as well. Like, bring that through.
Yeah. And, we get so much information from the person we're with, different signals, body language. So we be responsive. We'll get a sense of whether or not, like being a bit jokey about it is helpful and, is welcome. And then we can follow their lead a bit.
Absolutely. And so just the end here, if someone's listening who has lost somebody, so they're the person that's lost somebody, what's your message to them? What would you like them to be hearing today?
Well, I think I would just want to say well done for being here, for taking the time to do this for yourself, for clicking play and listening to this, because that's not easy. But that means that you have made a choice to make some space for your experience of grief. And that is important. And if you can do that a little bit every day in some way, I think that will be a really helpful resource, and you're not alone. That's the other thing I would want to say. There is an overwhelming number of people and organisations that are so passionate to accompany you, through this.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be such a lonely place.
Yeah.
And sometimes we need to be alone, but other times we do need to ask for help.
Yeah.
Or just company.
Yeah.
Even. It doesn't have to be help, but just company.
Yeah.
And knowing that there is people out there, again, friends, family, professionals, whatever it is that person needs, to know they're there. I do think it's quite hard when you've been bereaved to know where to get that from, like, you know, resources and things like that. So again, that's something that we're hoping to kind of develop and make sure people are able to get out there and get the support that they need. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been really, I've learnt a lot from talking to you today, to kind of that understanding how people are going through it, but also understanding how people are going through it that are supporting someone, because they're still going through it, because they're going through it with them. But there's one person going through the grief and one person going through support and the grief. And I think today we've covered both areas, so it's been really lovely to chat to you. And I'm sure listeners will have found that really useful to kind of understand perhaps their own grief and other people's grief.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome. Always come back as soon as you can. Okay, so if you feel that you need some bereavement support, please do get in touch via LivingGrief Bereavement Hub. You can do that by calling us. We've got an email, or you can check out our LivingGrief Bereavement Hub website. So thank you for listening to our LivingGrief conversation.